I thought my husband drowned until my daughter's terrifying confession. I, 37F, have a son, 12M, who I'll call Nathan, and a daughter, 14F, who I'll call Anna. A couple of months ago, I took Anna to a private hospital for a procedure to have 4 of her wisdom teeth extracted. Teeth that were, unfortunately, well embedded in her gums, necessitating the use of a general anesthetic. The doctor explained that it would be a lengthy procedure. Local anesthesia just wouldn't cut it. Anna wasn't best pleased about that, and neither was I. Now, anybody who's seen the aftermath of such sedation, whether in reality or from sadistic filmmaking YouTube parents, knows that it often leads to wonky, witty remarks. Though I didn't personally have a recording phone at the ready, I'll admit that I was hoping for some bizarre wordplay after the procedure. Instead, my daughter uttered something vile. Before I repeat her confession, I need to give you some context. My husband, Ed, used to go whitewater rafting with our 2 children and his brother Darren. Some years, I'd go with them, but work commitments often clashed. Anyway, Ed wasn't a particularly strong swimmer, so I always felt a little uneasy about the idea of him out on such unforgiving water without me. And in late 2022, my worst fear came true. A strong current pulled my husband under, and by the time Darren had recovered his body, it was too late. Ed drowned. The following months were awful, but Anna changed the most severely. To eke even a handful of words out of her became a rarity. But that didn't stop Uncle Darren from trying, from helping the family to heal in the wake of Ed's passing. It was no surprise to me when he offered to come to the hospital with us, keep Nathan company whilst Anna endured her long procedure. So, around 11 in the evening, when my daughter woke from the anesthesia, all of those factors were filling my mind. "Hello, darling," I said softly, using a pinky to hoist Anna's sweaty bangs out of her rolling eyes. "How are you feeling?" Anna's doped-up face observed me absently, but within the teary pools of her wandering eyes, there swam thoughts. Loose, disconnected thoughts, but thoughts that still meant something. And when she opened her mouth to speak, 2 wads of tissue spilled from her puffy cheeks. "The house looks empty," Anna said in a half-muffle, wafting both of her hands at the right-hand side of the hospital room, which was an unlit space lined with empty beds. "We're not at our house, Sweet Pea. We're in the recovery room," I explained, poking a slight gap between the overflowing tissues so I could hear her more clearly. "This is a hospital, remember? And you've got this massive space all to yourself, so I suppose it does seem quite empty." Anna mumbled something incoherent. "You've had your teeth removed," I continued, "and you're going to feel a little out of it whilst the drug wears off. Honey, where's the man?" My daughter asked in that low, disoriented moan. I smiled. "Dr. Addis? He's doing the rounds. But the nurse is here. Joyce. Remember her from earlier?" The young nurse, fiddling with various instruments on a trolley, looked up and beamed. "Hello again, Anna. Everything went well, and you're being really brave. I'm gonna run a few tests now, then we'll give you an oxygen mask to get you back into fighting shape. Make sure you tell me if you feel any pain or sickness, okay?" No, Anna groaned. "The man. She must miss Dr. Addis," Joyce giggled. I looked at the nurse apologetically. "Sorry." The woman grinned widely and shook her head. "Don't be silly, Mrs. Carey. I'm only teasing. Anna, I'm sure Dr. Addis will be back soon, but the man," Anna insisted loudly. "Nathan didn't see." "Sweetie," I began. Then my daughter's wide eyes shot to me, and she slurred her wretched confession. "Dad didn't drown. Don't tell Mom. He says he'll kill us if I tell Mom." There followed silence, a special silence which pressed heavily on the skin, weighing both Joyce and me to the floor. The nurse clearly felt something in Anna's words, something more than drug-induced nonsense. "Where is the man?" my daughter whispered, and I finally understood that she was not talking about Dr. Addis. Uncle Darren and Nathan were sitting in the corridor. That horrifying thought circled my mind as I processed what Anna said. A string of supposedly drug-induced words. That was what any rational person would believe, or at the very least want to believe. But a memory came to the forefront of my mind. Christmas Day, 2023. Darren made a pass at me. Gin and hormones, Cynthia. He sheepishly promised after I spurned him. That was all. I chose to accept that explanation, given that our entire family had already been through so much, but it never sat well with me. Even before Ed's death, something about Darren had never sat well with me. He forced himself upon our family after the death of my husband, his own brother. Injected himself into the main artery of our lives. And relatives should be there for a grieving family, obviously, but he tried, time and time again, to go above the call of duty. He continuously turned up at our house to take us for luxurious meals at restaurants. Incessantly coaxed the children into letting him sleep over at our home. Would manipulate me into agreeing. Feeding Nathan, primarily, with ideas that it would cruel for them to send me home at such a late hour. Sometimes, at night, I'd hear footsteps from the hallway. Wake in a sweat, quaking in fear as I wondered whether I'd left my bedroom door ajar. And once, I was certain I opened half-sleeping eyes to see a figure sitting on the chair in the corner of the room. But I told myself it had been a dream. One fevered dream of many. "Anna," I feebly whimpered. "Do you know what you just said? Was it true?" My daughter loudly shushed me, trying to lift a finger to her lips, but her dozy limb only half cooperated. "We don't speak about it. He says he'll hear if we speak about it. Says he's always listening." "Mrs. Carey," the nurse croaked. "Should I proceed?" I shook my head. I don't know. I don't know what we should be doing right now. Anna, was this a dream that you had? Please tell me that you... This, my daughter interrupted, showing a scar on her forearm. This wasn't from the ore. It was from him. My face turned pale as I eyed the faded scar on my daughter's arm. A scar that Darren claimed Anna had acquired from her, or after it hit a rock, causing a large, jagged splinter of wood to cut into her flesh. Before the accident, Anna talked. She hadn't been that way for 2 years, but an influx of anesthesia had reopened those old gates. I saw that in my daughter's tearful eyes. She wasn't aware of herself. Wasn't aware that she'd confessed a dark secret to her own mother. But the words were true. I didn't doubt that. Mrs. Carey, Joyce continued, still seeming uncertain as to what she should say or do. I'm going to find my son, I said calmly, standing from the bedside chair. Please watch Anna. My daughter's eyes grew as she finally seemed to identify my face. Mom, I seized her hand and squeezed. Everything's okay, sweetie. Just let Joyce look after you, okay? Right? Everything's okay, the nurse agreed weakly, as if I'd said the words for her benefit. I'll do those tests now. I rushed into the corridor and barreled forwards. But I was so lost in my thoughts, so lost in the laces of my Converse, that I didn't lift my head until I'd almost stumbled into the row of blue, plastic chairs at the end of the hallway. Mom, Nathan gasped, swiveling in his seat to look at me. What's wrong? I'd been too frightened to look ahead, too frightened to wear a false smile and act as if all were well. But there was something far more frightening about seeing my son sitting alone in the middle of the row. It was, of course, a blessing to know that I could snatch his hand and scoot him away without facing his questioning uncle. But it terrified me, nonetheless. After all, Darren had gone somewhere. Mom, slow down. Nathan pleaded, attempting to wriggle out of my handhold as I rushed towards Anna's room. I was ready to tear my daughter out of her bed, regardless of the nurse's advice. Sorry, Nathan, I panted as I shoved the door open. But I didn't finish that thought. The recovery room was alarmingly quiet. Anna's segment, semi-partitioned from the rest of the space by a thick curtain of green fabric, was the only lit section of the large area. One solitary fluorescent light hummed loudly above my daughter's bed, the only sound in the room. And my daughter had been left unattended. I rushed over to her bed and asked, "Where's Nurse Joyce?" Anna looked at me with teary eyes. "She's here." Rather than unpacking that, I pulled the duvet off her robed body. "We're going home now? Anna, come on. Nathan and I will help you stand." My son lifted his half-conscious sister with his shoulder under her arm, and I ran around to the other side of the bed. But before I managed to grab Anna from the left-hand side, I slipped, trained soul squeaking unbearably on the tiles below. Fortunately, my hand reflexively reached outwards and gripped onto the green curtain for security. I didn't want to look down, and when I did, I wished I hadn't. There, starting to stain the lower half of my white Converse, was a pool of red, a spreading pool that flooded underneath the partitioning curtain. This wasn't pulled so far across before, I thought, rubbing the fabric between my shaking fingers. I only noticed because my brain wanted a distraction from the horror of wading through a shallow pool of red. "Mom?" Nathan asked as he helped Anna stand on the other side of the bed. "What happened?" I answered not with words, but heavy breathing, and I lifted my stinging eyes to the curtain. Eyes that, if they'd been allowed, would have closed. But I had to do it, just as I had to look down. I knew what I would find, of course. I tore the curtain backwards to reveal, once again, the blackened side of the room, the 5 shadowy beds with unlit light fixtures above. I don't remember whether I screamed, as something in my terrified soul disconnected when I saw what lay on the neighboring bed. The lifeless body of Nurse Joyce. Her face, arms, and scrubs were drenched with thick layers of blood. Her mouth hung open in a final cry, and her eyes gone. Gone not in the sense that they had been clawed to ribbons, but in the sense that they had been plucked cleanly from their sockets. 2 deep, blood-filled cavities filled her skull. I turned to my children, and I was thankful that Anna's vacant eyes were staring at the corner of the room. However, Nathan saw Joyce's body, in spite of my effort to stand in the way, and he began to cry. Began to buckle under the weight of supporting his sister, for fear had weakened his body. "Look at me, both of you," I cried, nearly slipping in the blood a second time as I rounded the edge of the bed. "Please," Nathan bawled as I tried to sling Anna's right arm over my shoulder, hoping to escort both of my children out of that nightmare. But my daughter shrugged me off. Before I said a word, Anna pointed a shaking finger at the far corner of the room, pointed at something past the darkened beds. I think she might have tried to say something out of her tissue-filled mouth, some jumbled, muffled words, but she seemed even less coherent than before. And when I turned, I saw something worse than Joyce's body. There was just enough light to illuminate the vague outline of the room. The curtains drawn back to the wall, revealing the full stretch of the room. The 4 empty beds, and a 5th bearing the nurse's mutilated corpse. It was all made slightly clearer thanks to the window at the end of the room. A long glass pane which allowed a smidge of moonlight into the room. Onto the far corner, near the 6th bed, at which Anna was pointing, I saw the outline of an armchair, partially visible in that dark pit, and a dark, featureless head rising above the backrest. Somebody was sitting in the darkness, watching us. He wriggled like a codfish as his lungs filled with water. Came Darren's voice from the blackness. but I kept one of his ears above the surface, Cynthia. That way, you see, he could hear me explain in great detail all of the beautiful things I was going to do to you. Run! I shrieked at my children as the shape lunged forwards. There came the crying of my son, the door handle squeaking downwards, and shoe soles hurriedly beating against the floor, loudening as something invisible charged towards me. There is no horror quite like knowing that something in the dark approaches. A horror that fixed me to the tiles, left helplessly on my oncoming fate. Darren hurled into me, a heavy-set man with a bulging gut and eyes to match. And I was stuck so rigidly within his animalistic gaze, which saw only prey before it, that I barely noticed the searing pain in my gut. It came, of course, when the adrenaline started to wear off. It was always meant to be us, the man told me, his scentless breath stinging my eyes as he hovered an inch away from me. Realization hit once the terror abated. The terror of trying and failing to smell his breath. Inhuman breath, neither stale nor rosy. But that was Darren. He was nothing, just an empty vessel. And I'd always known that, somehow. Just never had any proof until that dreadful day. I realized as my abdomen started to throb that my brother-in-law had thrust something into me. Sharp steel buried in my flesh, and I would later learn to shy of puncturing my lung. Then Darren lifted his free hand to my hair and brushed it off my ear as he continued to twist the knife deeper into my gut. Some practiced idea of what it means to be human. Something he'd seen me do to Anna, I think. And that in itself made me feel sicker. Reminded me that this creature before me was no person. It propelled me though, motivated me, as Darren continued to talk, to plunge my quaking fingers into the back pocket of my jeans. Don't worry about this, the man whispered, motioning at the blade in my belly. I'll take you home now, quietly, and I'll get you fixed up. Then I'll look after you, baby. I'll tend to you, care for you, just as I have for the past 2 years. Look after you so much better than my weak, pathetic excuse for a... Halfway through the man's long monologue, powered by the last dregs of adrenaline and blood in my fading body, I punched my makeshift weapon forwards, a set of keys that I wielded between my 2 middle fingers. And I did not choose a non-fatal mark. I intended to put the man down. The keys met Darren's jugular, and his flapping lips froze mid-sentence. Then my husband's killer released his gripping hand, leaving the knife in my gut, and moved it towards his bleeding neck. Tried to cover the wound as he stumbled backwards, spluttering specks of blood. I moved with his body as he pulled away, fearing what would happen if I were to lose that opportunity. I jabbed those keys into his jugular repeatedly, intending to inflict as much damage as possible, intending to stop Darren from ever hurting my family again. I didn't want him to rot in prison, as I knew I would forever live in terror of him finding me again. The next time, he wouldn't have kept me alive to do as he wished with me. He would have ended me. Above all else, I wanted Darren to drown as Ed had drowned. Worse, in fact, as he drowned in his own blood. The authorities say I stabbed Darren 46 times. Let his neck a mangled mound of skin and blood. He was pronounced dead before the police even arrived on the scene. Responders called by Dr. Addis, who dialed 999 as soon as my children found him in a nearby corridor. He did, of course, rush to Darren's aid. Such was his oath. That was why I'd ensured that there would be no salvaging him. You see, I knew that it would never end. Not really. I will always hear, as I lie in my room at night, Darren's unholy confession of what he did to the love of my life. Hear an unspoken confession of what he was going to do to me.